Task Force, Chancellor Scott is going to make a few opening comments, and we'll turn it over to Executive Vice Chancellor Skinner.
Well, earlier I talked a little bit about some of the encouraging support we're receiving up and down the state. We've received endorsements by both the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce and the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce. And the other day I had a brief conversation with Alan Zarenberg, and he felt like that the statewide Chamber of Commerce would endorse the Student Success Task Force. As I said, editorially, nearly all the papers that have chosen to respond to the task force have responded very positively that the community colleges are moving in a direction that's quite good. And we've appreciated very much the work of the Campaign for College Opportunity. I see Jesse Ryan in our audience, and they have been most helpful in securing the support of groups like MALDEF and others to the Student Success Task Force. Occasionally, you know, there are myths that circulate, and I thought I might just briefly address 3 or 4 myths about the Student Success Task Force so that there'll be a clear understanding of it. Now, some of the myths I won't go into great detail on. I read one write-up by a professor who thought that this would increase suicides, and I haven't yet figured how that would work, but so I don't want to address that particular myth. But here are some things that I want to address. One is some people say, and it's been reported, that we are only going to enroll full-time students. Well, that's not true at all. The task force did suggest that perhaps when somebody wants to apply as a part-time student for financial aid, they might be shown what they would get if they went full-time, not to force them to do that, but all the studies seem to indicate that full-time students are those who tend to succeed more than part-time students. So I just wanted to clarify that. Others have said, well, it's going to disadvantage, your recommendations are going to disadvantage low-income and minority students. Well, there are 2 of our recommendations that we think will specifically encourage minority students. One of the recommendations is that we will have a success scorecard at every college, and it will not only will show success on an overall basis, we'll break it down in terms of ethnicity, so that if a college, for instance, determines that they're not performing as well with their Latino students as they are with students as a whole, then they can address that issue. Secondly, priority enrollment. I talked earlier this morning about moving first-year students in giving them some priority and putting avocational students maybe at the end of the line. Well, first-year students are more likely to be minority students than the student body as a whole, and avocational students are less likely to be minority students. So if we are able to institute priority enrollment, that will be very helpful to individuals who are students of color. And finally, someone has said that our recommendations will interfere with collective bargaining. Now, there's nothing in these recommendations that have anything to do with collective bargaining, so I'm not quite sure why that has been stated, but I just want you to know that we haven't yet been able to discover anything in these recommendations that have to do with collective bargaining. So maybe, I just thought maybe clearing up a few myths might be helpful. But the main thing is that this board, and I appreciate it a great deal, this board acted and endorsed these recommendations. And I'm sure you're interested in how are we going to implement these recommendations, because a lot of people have raised questions. For instance, some legitimately have said, well, where are you going to get the money? And we've tried to point out that there are some of these that will have to be implemented over time because of a lack of resources. But we've thought a lot about implementation, and we thought we could share with you today, and our Vice Chancellor Skinner is going to share with you a little bit about methods in which we can implement the recommendations of the task force.
Chancellor, let me add that also in my meetings with the Chancellor and staff as well, I have asked, based on our action and our discussion, that the Chancellor's office come back to us quickly with recommendations and things that we can consider to act upon. So it is certainly my intent as chair to move forward in an expeditious yet considerate matter. So with that, Eric, proceed.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President, Chancellor, members of the board. I'm going to provide you with an update on implementation of the Student Success Task Force recommendations. This is an informational item only, and the purpose is to bring you along in terms of what we've been doing here in the Chancellor's office to move forward. So no doubt about it, we've shifted gears from the task force planning to an implementation phase. And that has been a consuming process. I'm presenting now, but it's really been the, all the cabinet here, all the vice chancellors and the chancellor. It's been our full focus in terms of moving forward on implementation, along with the staff that back us all up. And depending on your level of interest and what we get into, I'll very likely pull other people up to weigh in, because they'll have additional layers of detail that might be relevant. But my goal is to step through some of the major issues, and then a few of the specific proposals that are underway in terms of implementation right now. Just building off the Chancellor's comments about some of the misinformation, I think one of the encouraging aspects as we shift gears, it's quite evident to me that as we move forward into more concrete, tangible conversations of these implementation, of these recommendations, a lot of that misinformation just gets blown away. The misunderstandings of what the proposals are about, misunderstandings of how we're intending to implement them, are dispelled. And I think that it's going to be really a great chapter for us as we move forward. I think we're going to see a lot of commonality behind these recommendations that will emerge as we have these more concrete, substantive conversations. That's what I've seen so far, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it. So in terms of the major issues, some of this is review, but I'll go through it quickly. The task force recommendations really are going to be implemented through a variety of policy mechanisms. There are a few proposals that will require statutory changes. There are more of the recommendations that will involve regulatory action, where you as a board will have the opportunity to step forward and provide some leadership for the system through regulation. And then there are many of the recommendations that are simply going to be a matter of identifying best practices, advertising those to the districts, disseminating those best practices, and then the local leadership will have the opportunity to step up and implement those recommendations that make sense at the local level. And so it's really going to be a spectrum of different kinds of policy mechanisms that will be employed, and you'll see that as we move forward. In terms of the time frame, this is an ambitious plan. These recommendations really touch almost every aspect of how the colleges operate. And I think realistically, this has to be viewed as a multi-year phase-in. That doesn't mean it's a slow process. I mean, as I think you'll see as we step through talking about the specific proposals, the gears are turning now. But it's, we've been looking at this as an issue that there's a great urgency for us to move forward. But given the seriousness and the magnitude of these changes, we can't act in haste. We need to be thoughtful. We need to go through the necessary vetting in order to make sure that we move forward responsibly on these proposals. So it's not going to happen overnight, but that said, as we step through the specific proposals, I think you'll see that the action has already begun. Really a pillar of implementation is going to be our reliance on work groups representing the expertise that resides out there in the colleges. It really is a truth of our system that the most distinguished expertise in our system really resides at the local level. And not to knock any of us here in the Chancellor's office, I think we do a great job, but I think the more we realize that there's that great leadership and knowledge out in the districts, the better off we are to leverage that. And so for each of the recommendations, there will be work groups that will be pulled together in order to help inform the implementation, help think through the various implementation options, analyzing the impacts, assessing costs, considering appropriate phase-ins, et cetera, for each of the recommendations. And those working groups are going to really tap into practitioner expertise from across our system. That's been our focus. And we'll step through a few of the working groups that are already underway. Wherever possible, we're going to try to rely on work groups that already exist. For instance, on common assessment, there's already an assessment advisory committee. Those are experts that have been selected to provide expertise on assessment issues in the past. It's a natural place to go to tap into advice. In many cases, those working groups are going to be augmented on a temporary basis, adding additional seats to those working groups in order to have broader perspective. And lastly, another major issue, a key element of implementation is communications. We are committed to bringing these implementation issues through Consultation Council on a monthly basis, having an open and robust conversation in Consultation Council, and relying upon that meeting as an opportunity to keep all our stakeholders informed about where we're going. We don't want there to be surprises in this. And another facet of communications is Vice Chancellor Feast has and his staff have developed an online newsletter about Student Success Task Force implementation. I think one issue has gone out so far, if I'm correct, and another one's about to go out, maybe during this board meeting even. And again, that's another vehicle we can use for communicating the work that's underway. So those are some of the major issues and elements that we're working, mindful of as we work towards implementation. So what I wanted to do is shift gears into talking about the specific proposals, and I'll do this quickly. Really, we could spend a considerable amount of time, and I'll be deferential to your wishes as a board on these proposals. So, but I'm going to begin by going through them in a fairly succinct fashion, and then if your questions
Eric,
indicate a deeper interest, then I will ask vice chancellors to join me up here.
Okay. So, Eric, are you going to go over the proposals that are going to come back to us, for instance, in May?
Correct. That's in the mix.
Right. So that's what we're talking about now.
Well, what I'm going to talk about are the elements that we're working on here in the Chancellor's office.
Okay.
Some of those will end up coming back before you, and I've got 6 proposals that I wanted to just briefly touch on.
Okay.
To begin with, in your legislative agenda as a board, you've identified 3 recommendations that you want to move forward on, and so those recommendations are contained in 2 bills. Right. The first bill is SB 1456, Lowenthal. So it's Senator Lowenthal's bill, and it contains 2 provisions, 2 task force recommendations. One is the Student Support Initiative. This is the kind of the bolstering, the kind of refocusing of the matriculation program, and identifying it as the Student Support Initiative. And so not only focusing on the existing program, but laying a platform for us to advocate for additional resources to support those key student services. Also in that same piece of legislation is the proposed changes to the Board of Governors fee waiver. And so this is attaching some additional eligibility requirements to the Board of Governors fee waiver regarding academic performance.
That's, both of those things are in the one bill?
Yes, that's correct. SB 1456, Senator Lowenthal's bill.
Okay.
The second piece of legislation is a Lou Bill, SB 1062. This is the bill that deals with the Chancellor's Office. It's recommendation 7.1 of the task force report. That recommendation deals with the need for us to have greater autonomy as a system, and to have kind of stronger leadership, and to operate more as a system. Those are some of the concepts that the task force discussed. The Lou Bill specifically has two elements in it, and Vice Chancellor Garcia, I think, referenced at least one of them earlier, which was on the regulations adopted by the Board of Governors. When you adopt regulations currently, those regulations are then shipped to the Department of Finance for their review. If they find that there's a fiscal impact, they have the authority to block, they have the legal authority to block those regulations from going into effect. And in the past, honestly, there have been times when it's been a very tenuous kind of argument. It appeared that the resistance was far more on a policy basis as opposed to a true fiscal basis. And so having your regulations second-guessed by another entity, it undercuts the autonomy of the system, undercuts your authority as a board to set policy. So one of the recommendations is to lessen Department of Finance's role, not to remove it, but it's simply, if Department of Finance identifies a fiscal impact, it's our job, it's your job, and really the Chancellor's Office job to identify the funding source to back that up. So they no longer would have the clear authority to block the regulations.
I just have a question. I mean, one of the key things to the success is the implementation and the timing of the different aspects of implementation. Are you not going to provide us with an outline that shows what items you're moving forward with, and what like the order of items that we're moving forward with, so we can understand the impacts to students on that? Are you going to provide us with something like that? Because my concern is if you're just randomly telling us you're going to do this, you're going to do that, we're not looking at the big picture and understanding how each of these components is impacting another piece of the recommendations. Because that's the core success associated with this, is the timing of what's implemented at what point.
Sure, absolutely. And I can assure you there's been nothing random to how this has been moving forward. Maybe the presentation's random, and we can work to improve that over time. This is not a 1 month or a 2 month or a 3 month process that's ongoing. And so we can find better ways to report information of progress. I'd draw your attention to page 102 and page 103 of your agenda as examples of, I think it's an attempt to get at what you're talking about, Vice President Perez, about presenting an action plan for each of the individual recommendations along with some timelines. It's our intention to build those out for each of the recommendations and to put those into one master tracking document so that you can, again, it will specify timelines for each of the recommendations and the specific action steps that will be necessary in order to implement.
So will you bring that to us prior to bringing to us items for approval? Because to me, it's like we need to understand what the big picture of implementation looks like, and then we can look at the individual items. Because if you start bringing things forward for us to approve, but we don't understand the bigger picture of impact, we may inadvertently end up harming some of the students opposed to helping them be successful.
Yeah. Well, I think it's our intention to present that information. I mean, the way you asked that question was, well, I guess a couple thoughts on it. One is, keep in mind there are 22 recommendations. Each one of those recommendations probably has at least 3 or 4 sub-recommendations. So you're pushing 100 micro recommendations. You know, it is just the logistics of that are awesome. What we've identified and what I was attempting to do here is to identify 6 items that we are actively moving on now, and in order to create some progress, because we've identified those as items that are ripe for early implementation, and But I'm sensing in your question a desire to see some type of a grander matrix, and we could absolutely work towards something like that.
Chancellor Scott.
Let me clarify this, Vice President Perez. He has mentioned that there are 2 legislative bills. The timeline on that is August 31st. That's when that has to be acted upon. And the governor then has, I believe, 30 days to sign the bill. So these 2 bills have already been introduced. They have not yet been presented to committees. They will have to go through a committee of one house, such as in these two. These 2 bills will originate in the Senate. They will be then discussed in committee. They will then be brought before the Senate floor. They will then go to the Assembly Committee. They will then go to the Assembly floor. And if indeed they pass all of those tests, they will then go to the governor for his signature. So he has indicated that there are 3 recommendations, that Senator Lowenthal's bill includes 2 recommendations, and Senator Liu's bill includes 1 recommendation. And I think he will then, in time, present to you regulations that will be brought before this particular board. You've already adopted a legislative program, and fortunately, both of those have been approved by both the CEO board and by the CCC board as well. But we will keep you informed if in that process the bill that either Senator Lowenthal or Senator Liu are taking through are amended. And sometime, once we place a bill in the hands of an author, in other words, it's in the hands of the author. It's not in our hands. We can, on the one hand, I guess we could withdraw our support if we thought it was so badly amended that we couldn't support it anymore. But these were 2 bills that we considered required statute. And we were forced by the calendar to immediately introduce these bills. But I can assure you they won't be acted on. It'll probably be several months before they are actually go through the legislative process and are go to the governor's office for signature. But I'm sure that Vice Chancellor Skinner will then present to you some ideas for regulation as well.
Member Ramos.
Yeah, I think building on Vice President Perez's question, I appreciate the desire to have a large template that we work back from. But even in the conversation we're having now, maybe I can have either the Chancellor or Vice Chancellor Skinner, tell me if I'm right in this. I see, or I read this material as moving forward these initiatives that we're talking about legislatively because they were foundational. Because it seems to me that they establish the essential templates upon which you would have to build any of the other attendant items that we've proposed for policy. Now, maybe I misread that, but it seems to me like you can't have student success unless you have an initiative that essentially codifies that. You can't really do anything with that to incentivize the kind of outcomes you're looking for unless you use the fee waiver as a mechanism to do that. And you can't really do it without a strong chancellor's office. These are the kind of things that I was interpreting into the logic of why these were brought forward. So first, I guess I'm looking for validation that I didn't just invent that. But secondly, if that is true, then I think that building on this, it would help us going forward to the Vice President's suggestion to have the larger template that was requested to kind of work through as we build on this kind of, foundation.
Well, let me...
So is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, I believe you're very correct in the way you perceived it. And let me tell you that there are some of these that, as we said all along, this is a multi-year project. We know, for instance, that if we ask of every college that they require orientation, that they require, that we move toward a common assessment, which we're studying right now, and that those things may well require resources. And one of the criticisms we're catching from the field is everybody was frightened out there that we were going to suddenly place on the colleges all these responsibilities and they wouldn't have the resources to do it. So it's not that these 22 recommendations, it's not that we don't want to see them happen. some of them are best practices. So, like improve basic skills, we're not really legislating that. But some of these we have hesitated on because we know that there's a natural uneasiness out there in the field of you're asking us to do things that we don't have the resources to do. So some of these we're going to have to study what kind of resources are required. Now, I told you about a visit I made to West Hills College, and I was impressed by the fact that they implemented orientation, they implemented common assessment, and so forth. They required that of all these students who got priority, all these first-year students who got priority, and they seem to have done it rather inexpensively. But I can't say that's true of every college, and before we actually move on legislation, and I think we're just going to have to keep studying this issue, and we're right now trying to price it out. But we're a little hesitant to require of colleges things that we are fearful that they don't have the resources to do. Now, admittedly, Governor Brown and his giant plan has said that starting in 13-14, we're going to get 4% more money each year. And, that's a wonderful promise, but right now we can't spend promises.
So let me, and Member Malumed, you're next, but following up on Member Ramos's comment, yes, I think that's correct, and I think, at least in my discussions with the Chancellor and the office, what Eric is going to present, aside from the legislation, are the things he and the Chancellor and others feel that we could consider in the next, say our next meeting or so. I would also say that I would also endorse the Vice President's recommendation that as we move down that line, we do have a chart with a timeline, resources necessary. But what I would say is I don't think we need to wait for that right now. If there are 3 things that we could, or whatever the number is, Eric, that we could consider. Member Malumed.
I was going to, excuse me, ask if the monthly newsletter could be sent to the board members.
Right.
Because I don't think we got the first one, and I think that might give us a bigger sense of the picture also.
Well, that was absolutely an oversight, and I thought it had been forwarded. We'll
Yeah.
definitely do that.
That would be helpful, I think, because
Yeah,
I assume that would have a bigger picture.
Goes without saying, I slipped through the cracks. Sorry about that. Yeah.
The first one already went out? Yes, the communications one, and the first one already was in there? What are you titling it? Okay.
I'm going to suggest we break it out and send it as its own separate item to draw more attention
Because
to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So, Member McDougall, did you want to make a brief comment, and then Member Belinsky, and then I'd like to get Eric to get through his.
I was just going to
presentation.
reinforce what Vice President Perez said and Board Member Ramos. I don't think we're looking for anything extensive. I don't think we're looking for anything that necessarily even denotes action. All we're looking for is that scorecard of the 22 recommendations that follows this chart, which has 2 of them, very brief, and it may just state no action contemplated at this time under study.
Yeah.
So you can look at the entire report and know what is being activated and what is not. So
Member Belinsky.
Just 2 things, sir. One is, as you mentioned, about the work groups, and I'd kind of heard about that. I think if there's some way, as those work groups move forward, of providing in the newsletter or whatever, some kind of a summary of what they're doing, just to keep people informed, because, I mean, communication is everything. And it then brings about the transparency. So if the different work groups working on common assessment, well, what have they come up with? Just to be informed. And I'm making that up, or whether they're looking at cut scores or whatever. And the only other question I have, particularly like with the 1456 bill and the fact that it has to be done by August, I know that there are different groups that have come together and are weighing in on the language of the bill. Well, why is it said this way, or why was this cut out, or why was, because it's a reformulation of the 1986 Matriculation Act and coming up with a current version of it to fit the student success. If we, as a Board of Governors member, have suggestions and questions about the language, because I don't know, is there an appropriate way to raise that? And I could give an example, but, you know, in order to move on, but I mean, what's the methodology to say, I'd like to raise a question about this, so that it isn't I'm just emailing somebody and saying, well, is that even legit what I just did, is sending that person an email?
On that point, I'd make a suggestion that as we put the matrix out, essentially we have an effective point person on each of our proposals here internally, and we'll identify that on the matrix so that you have a specific point of contact. Actually, the most efficient way of sharing your input might be picking up the phone or sending that email, but if we tell you who that contact is, you know that you're hitting the target with it. And
So like for the Lowenthal, just so not trying to be difficult, but just to understand, like with the 1456 Lowenthal bill that we got the final version, so to speak, because there was one version in the agenda packet and another version that came later because it couldn't make the agenda. If we have suggestions of saying, well, you know, look at the way this is languaged, or like, look at the way this is stated, or will there be somebody in that matrix now that we could ask that question of?
yeah, we can let us identify the contact on it. I'd say it's
Vice Chancellor Garcia, correct? I mean, for our.
So the issue here is that
legislation, so-
really Linda's taking the point on the policy, and she's being the primary contact with the working groups on that. It's because it's a bill. Marlene's got to have some ownership on it, so the bill doesn't get, you know, start shifting to the side without her knowing about it. So I would let us identify the point, and before, rather than just make a decision on the fly on that one, let me just commit to doing that to you, and then for each of the recommendations, we will do that, so you know exactly who you can go to.
But for the bill, it's a separate recommendation, so to speak, because
Right.
the bill's like this invest in a student support initiative, and then it's got, you'll identify a person with the bill also.
Yes, I will. And I'll also give you this commitment that as the executive vice chancellor that's over all of this, at any point in time, if you contact me on it,
Okay.
if you have a question, I mean, trust me, we pay attention to when the emails come in from you, from the board members. That's a top priority, and I can make sure that I connect you with the right people. So.
Yeah, and I'm just asking it from the perspective of wanting to do it appropriately rather than inappropriate.
And I appreciate that.
So, Eric, why don't you
I can.
proceed?
Okay, let me quickly step through the other items that I have identified here, and so I went through the legislative package. So that was some direction that you gave us to move forward on some of the recommendations, and we're doing that in the legislative arena. There's another proposal having to do with increasing collaboration with K-12, specifically working on a common core. That's a recommendation that is fast-tracked, again, because it's moving on a schedule that we don't control. There are meetings happening right now between, you know, various K-12 stakeholders, the federal government, other higher education stakeholders, and so what we're doing is aggressively getting to the table and participating in those conversations. Essentially, what it has to do with is helping to shape the K-12 standards and the K-12 assessments, so that they send accurate signals, messages to students in middle school and high school about what it's going to take to be ready to be college or career ready.
And
So
Eric-
we're involved in those work groups with the State Board of Education and the Department of Education.
And that's something that requires no action from the Board of Governors. That's something our system is working with CDE on.
At this juncture, that one's in the realm of administrative policy, correct?
Thank you.
The next item is the scorecard. This is the accountability system that highlights of it being that, you know, on the college level, it would track student success outcomes, both the intermediate metrics, the tipping point metrics, like completing basic skills sequence, earning 15 units, earning 30 units, but also the completion metrics, earning a certificate, a degree, transferring, and also disaggregating those outcomes by race and ethnicity in order to monitor equity gaps so that we can work to close those gaps over time, and absolutely watch against any unintentional if those gaps are widening, we need to see that as a warning sign to evaluate how any policies that we're implementing may be exacerbating equity gaps. That's absolutely not the goal here. The goal is to close them. So the scorecard, that is something at this juncture, it's through the, there's an ARC advisory committee that's being reconvened, and that body will work on developing that scorecard. At some juncture, that may come back to this board for some type of for ratification or endorsement. We're assessing whether that is legally required. It may not be, but that said, you as a board may want to have ownership of that issue, which I guess I take the opportunity just to note, you're in charge. So as I tell you, these are the recommendations we're working on, and this is the timeline that we're working on. It's absolutely in your purview to turn around and say, well, how about this one and that one? And how about doing it faster? Or we're concerned that's too fast. Why don't you slow down and seek some additional input? That's really, this is our first opportunity as a cabinet to come before you, kind of lay out our implementation strategy. But we're very willing to take signals from you about how to proceed on this. So that's a scorecard, and the last element is enrollment priorities. This is the kind of latest breaking of the items. We've identified this as ripe for bringing a working group together in order. Clearly it's the issue of the moment, and it's really, it's been the issue of the last few years here as the state has divested from our colleges, and we've shut out students, not of our own desire, but because we didn't have the seats to take them in. It's really caused there's a pressing social crisis that's underway. And so in order to attempt to address that, the task force recommendation really calls for implementing smarter enrollment priorities. And so the working group will be convening on that. That will, the mechanism for implementation will be regulatory change. That will come through this Board of Governors. That is a meaty issue. That is a substantial issue, and be ready for that. The online instructional material conversation earlier today is nothing compared to that conversation. Yeah. So, we're trying to queue that up and have that work group develop and frame some specific enrollment priorities that can be implemented in the short term, and likely there'll be some longer term recommendations as well. But a reason why that's so pressing again is because in the current environment in which students are being shut out, there's a necessity to do whatever we can to try to bring as much equity and justice to those decisions as we can. So those are the elements that we've identified as targets for early implementation, and that because they're foundational issues, because there are other pressing time frames such as the Common Core that's just driving the train, or because for other reasons they were identified as again
things that we could do now.
Kind of useful recommendations to move on faster, and in some cases it's because there are items that can be done with little or no cost. Right. There's low-hanging fruit that we can grab and move forward on. So those are the items we've identified at this point, and again, the vice chancellors who have been pouring their labor into this can go into as much additional detail on this if you have questions.
All right. Eric, thank you for your work on this. Member Baum.
So my question gets to what can local districts do in taking on some of these task force recommendations and implementing? Because in the first meeting that I chaired as the new president of our board, and with Dr. Mann's help, who was a member of the task force, we passed an endorsement resolution endorsing the recommendations, and then calling for our district to be an active district in implementing the recommendations. So what's the message to districts around the state?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the message to districts is that this reform movement, this drive to improve our success and our completion rates as a system, is an agenda that we, as a system, need to embrace. And I really think that there's a widespread commitment to doing that. I think the most powerful, and I'm kind of stealing words here from my boss, but you know, the most important and powerful reforms that come out of this effort are going to be those that are developed at that local level. And so we see in West Hills, you know, what they've accomplished. You know, Long Beach has done some fabulous things in terms of partnering with their local K-12 schools. We can look around our system and find some exemplary best practices. And so what we encourage districts to do is we encourage local boards to meet, to talk about this task force report, to look at student success and explore local student data, outcome data. That's what really should drive these conversations. Look at those local success, you know, look at the local data about student success and use that to drive local reforms. That's one response.
Okay, Chancellor Scott, then Member McDougall.
Let me go behind that. Number one, there's not a single recommendation here that you can't go ahead and implement on a local level. For instance, enrollment priority. We would like to get it system-wide, but as West Hills illustrated and a lot of others have illustrated, I know that 2 or 3 years ago, City College of San Francisco had a first-year priority for some students, and the results were amazing. That how they completed at a higher rate and so forth. I believe these were San Francisco high school students that were given priority registration. So there's nothing to prevent. In fact, there's everything to encourage colleges to take their own steps. I know Michelle Pilati shared with me the fact that there's a lot of discussion going on at Rio Hondo College about student success. And a lot of these will be simply particular to that college. That college has some things that they could implement. I hesitate to use this slogan since it came from, I believe, Marxist China, but wasn't it let a thousand flowers bloom? I'll go ahead and use the metaphor. So let 1,000 flowers bloom. Just go to it. There's nothing. We're going to try to implement some things on a system-wide basis, but that's not to stop. In fact, that's to encourage local colleges to carry on their own conversations and to come up with ideas by which they can improve student success. We talked about how the student success student success scorecard would highlight not only overall success, but it would break it down by ethnicity. Well, suddenly, if you if you spot that ways in which you can implement certain programs, I know that Puente, for instance, was highly successful as a program for Latino students. If you might not be able to get the money for it, but who knows? Maybe you could go to a local foundation and get them to underwrite some of these experimental things that you want to try in terms of basic skills. So please don't think that there was anything about this overall task force that in any way inhibits local innovation. All we're looking for is student success. And whatever those things are that will make for greater completion, greater student success, we're all for it. So I've said that before, but I just couldn't help but say it again, that I think some of the greatest things that's going to happen is going to be that individual discussions and innovations and ferment that's going to happen on local campuses.
Member McDougall.
Yes, I'd just like to acknowledge that it was only 2 months ago that this board took action on the recommendations, and only 1 month ago that those recommendations were presented to the joint Legislative Committee. And I really want to thank both Chancellor Scott and Vice Chancellor Skinner for the progress that is being made. I mean, it's clear that this is being taken seriously. I think, from my perspective, what has been expressed today by the board is tremendous support for continuing to move ahead, to wanting to have that broad view of all the recommendations in the task force, so we have a sense of the whole as well as the pieces, and some capability to know how to stay in touch with that process and voice, if you will, opinions as it proceeds. So I think it's very good discussion and
Yes,
good results.
I think that's well said, Member McDougall. Member Belinsky.
Maybe, a different idea from my perspective of somebody in a college district, but has there been any sense of, say, even sending a letter out to presidents and chancellors of the 72 districts, the colleges, that once again reminds them that this was passed, that legislation is moving forward, but, we really want to encourage you to take the first step yourselves to determine how to implement these and maybe to share those best practices like West Hills did back with us so that we could put that out there to people. Here's some best practices, so don't think it's not achievable if over here they did it and it seems to be.
Okay.
Good suggestion.
Okay. Other comments from the board? Okay, Eric, thanks so much for your hard work and staff for the hard work on this. I know this has been a lot to do, and you all have done terrific. I very much appreciate it, and I know my colleagues feel the same. We have a speaker.
William Walker, City College of San Francisco.
Yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon, governors. Seems like I'm a meeting late, but I'd like to still share my story, and I'd like to appreciate Vice President Perez for requesting a timeline. I think that there is still a lot of discontent around the recommendations that you've all passed, and there's still a lot of misinformation and a lot of uneducation about it. Like I have not been able to digest the 65 pages, let alone fully comprehend what's going on to the system. But I'll tell you that I personally believe that I won't be able to benefit from attending community colleges because of the recommendations being passed. In 2010, just shortly after I petitioned for my first AA degree, even though I had the units for probably 8-9 years, I petitioned for my degree in 2010. That same year, I was terminated from my job while I was on medical leave. I have a hand injury that I sustained that took me out of the workforce for a year. I was working with the Department of Rehabilitation and the Employment Development Department, who both told me to go back to school to retrain. I already have 70 units, at least that I can identify. I probably have more than that, but 70 that went toward my AA. I have a disability. I don't make a full-time salary. And by saying that you're going to limit the BOG waiver to folks at 110 units would prevent me from being able to pursue a training certificate in another field at a community college. And it will leave me, because my community college GPA isn't the best. I don't know that I'll make it into a 4-year school without the benefit of being able to attend school. And if I'm being asked to pay $46 a unit and I don't have income, it makes it really difficult for me to achieve my goals. I'm a geographic information system certificate is what I'm pursuing, in case you're curious. But I will add that I think that the Student Success Task Force doesn't look at statewide improvements that could possibly improve a lot of the budget constraints that you have. When UCs face this same situation, they looked at merging all of their functions in regard to transcripts and maintenance of grade databases. You had a gentleman here speaking about the athletic performance and how there's a CalPAS system. If all of the grades were kept in the database, you could keep your own statistics on how successful students are meeting any of your objectives as a college institution at all 72 districts. There should be more partnerships with programs like EDD that actually require people to do training. Why can't those hours in training be looked at as hours toward community college enrollment and look at getting funding for those resources? There's so many other. I have a list here. It's funny how I sat in this meeting with 4 points. I have like 22 points here, and I'm still writing more points down. I think that there's a lot more that you all need to discuss. And if the Student Success Task Force is so great, I think it's pushing me out. Have town halls in all 72 of your districts and have people really discuss it. Bringing something out in November and releasing the result in January, it's just something you guys should really look at. Thank you. Sorry I went over time.
Okay. Yeah, Chancellor Scott.
First, William, I want to thank you for coming and expressing your concern. Maybe there are several things we haven't made as clear as we should. One is that in all of these rules or regulations, we have indicated there will be an appeal process. We understand that there are some students that will require 110 units, but we feel like that we can't keep educating students way beyond 110 units, or a lot of students, and saying no to those who want to get in for the first time and are being turned away. So we would simply say that in all of these things, we have made it clear that there will be an appeal process. You know, it'd be nice if we could if we could have 72 town halls. We can't quite do that. We did have 4 town halls in 4 different places in the state. We did go to about 30 different groups, including the Student Senate and the Academic Senate and the CEOs and the CSSOs and et cetera, et cetera. So we finally reached the point at which we thought we'd received a lot of input, and there came the time when we had to go ahead and make some decisions. But I will say that every college will have the right to have an appeal process, and that whether any of these rules and regulations are, if they don't fit a particular case, the college will have the right to say, as a result of that appeal, we will not apply this rule. So I'm glad you brought that to our attention. We will maybe we haven't made that as clear as we should have in our communication, but I want you to know that we want to do that. Always when you do something like this, you know, it's not perfect, but right now what's happening is very imperfect. That's our problem. I mean, we're turning away over 100,000 students every year that can't even get in. And then we have these individuals who are taking nice avocational courses, but they don't seem to be quite as important. Even the legislature said that we ought to emphasize basic skills. We ought to emphasize career technical education, as our speaker was talking about, or we ought to emphasize transfer education. So that's why we have done what we have. I wish we had twice the resources that we have. And I can tell you that I think the state of California is making a huge mistake in its failure to fund higher education. And I hope tomorrow when we go and talk to legislators that we make this very clear. But we have to go ahead and prioritize what resources we get.
Okay. Chancellor and Vice Chancellor Skinner, I'd like to ask at the request of Vice President Perez and Member Ramos and others, and Member McDougall, if you would take a look at that timeline, maybe for our May meeting, and come back if you're able to do it. And I think it was a good suggestion from Member McDougall, even if you had something, a certain recommendation, no action contemplated right now, or those, I think that'd be helpful to us as a board. I think that's all we have, and, oh, we have another speaker, okay? Okay, could you introduce yourself and where you're from? We don't have a card here.
Sure, sure. Thank you. My name is Jeffrey Fang. I'm student trustee at City College of San Francisco. I'm also the Region 3 Senator of the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. I just want to thank you for allowing me to have the opportunity to speak. And I'd like to just say that it has been said that change is hard, change is necessary, but there's also an ancient Chinese saying, which I'm an immigrant from that country, and I believe that's said it very well. Change at breakneck speed will stunt growth. So the issue is not really whether the proposed items that was in the Student Success Task Force is all bad. It's more of, now that it has been endorsed, the ship has sailed, there's still great amount of discomfort within the system. The buy-in is not really there. So there does need to be more of an outreach continuously. I understand that will put strain on everyone to still try to get more outreach and try to output the information and get as much input as possible still, but that is necessary and is needed in order for the process to really work out. So I know there's an impotence for change and for do it quickly, but it may not be the best thing if we push too hard on this one. There still needs to be thought, and there still needs to be research done, even though some of the motivation and fundamental principle behind it may be sound, some of it may be not. We need to look at it still. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, any other comments?
Move to adjourn?
Okay, 1 second. And Jerry, just to confirm, our dinner tonight is 6 p.m. at Spataro, and we start at what time tomorrow morning?
8:30.
Right, 8:30.
You'll meet up on the fourth floor conference room.
Fourth floor conference room at 8:30. Okay, and so the van will be there at 8:10. Okay. All right, meeting is adjourned.